Welcome to Strip Coverlet, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I am Adrian Fort, and we are here for a poetry discussion. This video will, of course, take place in the poetry discussion playlist here on the channel. This is a poem from the enigmatic Wallace Stevens. If you want to read some poetry that will definitely make you say, yeah, so what, the first 2 or 3 times that you read it, Wallace Stevens is the poet for you. But there are definitely things roiling under the surface of Wallace Stevens' poetry, and we are here to talk about one of these poems today, the poem in question, Anecdote of the Jar, and it reads as such. I placed a jar in Tennessee, and round it was, upon a hill. It made the slovenly wilderness surround that hill. The wilderness rose up to it and sprawled around, no longer wild. The jar was round upon the ground and tall, and of a point in air. It took dominion everywhere. The jar was gray and bare. It did not give of bird or bush like nothing else in Tennessee. So, what is this poem about? Obviously, it's about the fact that Tennessee is a useless piece of land. No, that's not it at all. Here's where we need to start. How do we read this word right here, anecdote? How seriously do we take that word? What are we doing with that word? If you are to consult the larger canon of sort of literary criticism, what they will say is that this poem is what we used to refer to as man versus nature, right? There are only several types of story. Man versus nature is one of them. You think of To Build a Fire, for example. It is a man alone in the vast cold, the vast expanse of nothingness, the vast expanse of cold and wet, and he has to build a fire. Will he be able to build that fire? Will man conquer that bit of nature? And you can understand, I think, why this poem would be looked at in that way. If we say anecdote is a literal meaning of the word anecdote, there's no irony here, there's no sarcasm in the use of the word anecdote, that anecdote, meaning roughly cure, the cure of the jar, is placed in the wilderness, and the wilderness conforms. The wilderness rules over the nature. The jar, of course, being human-made, which would bring this poem a very strong man versus nature type of connotation. Do we want to stop there? I think there is perhaps something else to be said for, or maybe with, this poem, maybe about this poem. What is a jar? Not AJAR, but just JAR. It's used for carrying something, right? The jar is not itself about the jar. The jar is about what is inside the jar. Are you, when you buy a jar of jelly or jam, a jar of peanut butter, are you as excited about that piece of glass or plastic as you are that jam, that jelly, that sweet honey roasted peanut butter? Of course not. It's what is inside that counts, right? It's what's inside that is the meaningful part, not the jar itself. But here we have, I can't shake this cold, guys. Here we have this jar being set in the wilderness, and the wilderness exceeds expectation. What if that jar, meaning to contain, that jar being the container of the good stuff, being set out there, what if that introduces the idea of the higher calling to the wilderness? And the wilderness rose up to it, sprawled around about it, no longer wild. What does wild itself mean? Wild, it means chaos. That's the dragon. The wilderness is the dragon. That's chaos. Right? If I can internet meme it up while I've got a cold. The jar itself is discipline. The jar itself is promise. The jar itself is the ability. The jar itself is discipline. We have the jar being placed out there, and what it does is simply introduces the idea of this thing. So there's something called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And insofar as I understand what this actually is, what this actually means, it is that until our human construct has a word for something, until our mind, our brain, our sense of being has a word for something, we cannot properly intellectualize it. What if that extends beyond just the human experience? So this idea of having a word for it means that we can actually intellectualize it. You've heard the phrase, Eskimos have 400 words for snow. Whatever the actual number is, I don't know. Well, there's a very good reason for that. Snow is a very large part of their life. They have to know that some snow is the snow that you don't go hunting in. Some snow is the snow that you pack into bricks. Some snow is the snow that's good for speed. Some is the snow that's good for X. Some is the snow that's bad for Y. To differentiate those, you invent a different word, and it becomes a completely different thing. In the Midwest, in Kansas City, if it's going to snow, that can mean it's going to snow. That can mean it's going to sleet. That can mean that there's going to be very fine snow, that there's going to be very gravelly snow. It's snow. We don't differentiate it all that much. It is not that large a part of our lifestyle. What if that is not a human construct? It is not a human thing to say, once we have a word for it, we can differentiate it, we can fine-tune it, we can plan for it, we can manipulate it and overcome it. What if that is a fact of the universe? Now, I'm not necessarily saying that Wallace Stevens is going all that deep here. I think that the wilderness can be a metaphor for your mind. The wilderness can be a metaphor for your life. The jar becomes a metaphor for discipline. The jar becomes a metaphor for potentiality. By introducing the idea of potential, by introducing the very idea of discipline, our reality becomes more conformed. Our reality becomes more harvestable. The wilderness growing around this jar is no real good for the jar, and it's not that much good for the wilderness. If the wilderness knows, here's where I can grow the strawberries, the wild berries, that's good for the wilderness. If the foragers, the foraging animals, know this is where the strawberries grow, it's good for the foraging animals, which in turn becomes good for the wilderness. So we have in our personality, in our world, in our existence, all of these wild things, these wild elements. For me personally, creativity. For me personally, writing. If I know those strawberries of writing, that writing grows best in the time after I get off from work. I know that's a wild thing, but I can still tweak it. The wilderness knows that the strawberries have to grow in a wild fashion, but they grow best in the shade. So we can make sure that they're under a big tree. I have no idea if that's where strawberries grow best. But you see what I'm saying? The moment that we introduce the idea of the jar, the idea of the discipline, the idea of the higher potentiality, the higher calling into our life, the moment that we do that, even our wilder aspects become instantly more harvestable. That is all I have for this poetry discussion. If you like or appreciate what I do here, hitting the like button always helps me out on the channel, as it tells YouTube to share this video with other literature lovers. And if you find yourself here by chance but not design, literature is the only thing I talk about on this channel, dropping 4, 5, 6, 7, sometimes even more videos. Each week, there's poetry to be found every Monday. I have uploaded a video every day for almost 9 months now, I think it is. So hit the subscribe button and stick around for more poetry. And as always, I hope to have you back for the next one.